Thank you, Ray, and thank you, everyone. So I'm Gaelle Bertrand, and I head up social media intelligence at Kantar Media. My presentation is going to be much more a thinking piece rather than all the practical pieces that we've had so far today. So I wanted to start with a statistic which suggests that 35% of current UK employment is at risk of being replaced by a robot or similar technology by 2030, which I think is quite a scary statistic. You've got eminent people as well in our world who talk about AI, and there's very diverging views of what the benefits of AI are. So if you listen to Elon Musk, for example, he considers that AI is an existential threat for humanity, and he calls for greater regulations around AI. And then if you listen to Mark Zuckerberg, obviously the founder of Facebook, he believes that AI will save lives and help bring people together and generally make the world a better place. So you've got very diverging view of what AI can bring. You have seen AI as a force for the good mostly today in the talks. I personally sit in the middle as to what AI can bring, and here is why. But before I start getting into the heart of what I want to talk about to do today, which is what machines bring or AI bring and what humans can bring alongside machines, I think it's important to distinguish between automation, and we have talked about automation today, and AI, and sometimes interchangeably. So automation is a machine performing a set of predetermined actions based on a routine. So it's not a machine necessarily learning from its environment, but just a machine just doing a task that is repetitive and based on a routine which a human might have actually taught it. AI, by contrast, tends to be more rational and flexible, and it perceives its environment and also helps derive positive outcomes by adapting to it. So for example, what we've seen on Python today is a good example of that, where you give it a big data set and you give it some commands, and it's able to learn from what the text is saying, which I really liked. Actually, I thought it was really useful, and I didn't think it was that simple, to be fair, and I'm sure that's the same for most people listening to this webinar, and I'll go and check it out. But what I wanted to say by defining these two terms is that the two are often considered to be one and the same, and they're not actually the same. Artificial intelligence is about intelligent automation. It's about deriving something valuable, which is able to free up humans. So if you look at the example that we've just seen, AI does exactly that. Is that instead of having somebody sifting through those 50,000 records, you've got the machine doing it for you, so that it summarizes the data, and then a human can look at it and think, great, this is the most important keyword. Why is that the most important keyword? Or these are the most important authors. So it allows humans then to apply their brains to think more critically. And I think the issue here is that the more technology is available and simpler to access, the more there is a misconception around what tools or machines can deliver and what humans can deliver. In a research context in particular, inside delivery is often promised as a benefit of using machines, and actually I don't really agree with that. I think that what machines help us do is do the heavy lifting, and they help us get quicker to the insight, but they're not necessarily deriving the insight themselves. I'm yet to see a machine which has derived an insight itself, and I personally think that we are quite a long way away from having a machine that will actually deliver insights automatically. And the reason why I think that is because inherently insight is human, or it's human driven, and it is subjective, and ultimately it's about driving actions. It's about looking at what you see and deciding what to do next, or understanding why that is. So what role can AIs or machine help us perform? And here I'm going to focus specifically on the applications of AI to social media, which is what I know most intimately, although the first part of my working life was as a more traditional researcher. So what the applications are mostly of social media, and the outcomes, I believe, though, are the same really as any unstructured data. So we've seen some, well, actually it was slightly structured, the example that we saw, but applying AI to that, we've actually seen a great example of what AI can do, because machines can effectively help the human, first of all, collect the data. So in social media, if we didn't have machines, or if we didn't have tools to collect the data, we wouldn't be able to do anything, because collecting social media data manually would be a very, very cumbersome and lengthy process. And quite frankly, we would need the whole world to start collecting data by themselves to be able to access the content that we have access to. So what machines do, i.e. social media listening tools, they scrape the content for us and give us access to the data flows. So it's quite an important role that machines play. And in order to do that, they obviously, the machines use AI techniques, not just automation. If we then look at some of the more advanced machine-led techniques that are used to analyze social media content, such as natural language processing or deep learning, some of which were mentioned in the previous talk as well, they can help you uncover themes and patterns and trends in the data, which is of course useful for any researcher wanting to make sense of the social media content they've got in front of us. The key, though, is that you still need humans to help machines learn how the content you are analyzing is structured. So you need humans to help give that structure at the outset so that they can read it. And you also need humans to be able to interpret and form considerations on how to take actions in the real world from the data you're analyzing. And I think it's the specificity and the interpretations that humans can add that is absolutely key to drive this actionability. It's true with social media, but it's true of any data, really, I think. And I do believe that, because the role of researchers and insight specialists, in my mind, is to challenge the accepted truths and beliefs that you have out there. So I think only a human brain at the moment can do that. And machines, however learned they are programmed by humans at the end of the day, and for the time being might be able to learn from their environments, but are not necessarily capable of challenging the accepted. So we are not yet there. I wanted to give you a perspective on AI and chess, because I thought it was an interesting example and an interesting perspective on what AI brings and what it doesn't bring to an activity like chess. So if like me, you grew up in the 80s, and you probably have heard of Karpov and Kasparov, who were the masters of chess at that period. They were the grandmasters until the mid-90s, when in 1997, the IBM Deep Blue supercomputer beat Garry Kasparov over 6 games. And Kasparov gave a TED talk rather recently, about 2 years ago, and he recounted his experience of playing against and being beaten by this machine. And what he said is that by going through this experience, he had actually questioned the future of the game, because he described that as soon as AI was introduced to the game, so as soon as he began playing against a machine, he found the game of chess really functional, because fundamentally it was then being driven by fast hardware and very smart algorithms being able to play chess successfully and beating him. He also admitted that despite being amazed at what a machine could achieve, he had realized that something was missing essentially from the game. So actually he realized that what he really enjoyed about playing that game was the human component, seeing his opponent thinking about their next move, and really sort of realizing what had made interest in the game and the interest of many players over the 100 years that the game has been played. It's looking at a human and trying to understand their feeling and trying to second guess by looking at their body language or their emotional response, what their intentions are. And I think that's basically what summarizes a little bit how I feel about AI in the context of data analysis, is that and specifically in the context of social media research, is that social media is a really personal medium where people express their thoughts and their feelings. And I feel that if you leave a machine to interpret it, you're missing a trick. And that's why I'm talking to you today, trying to make the case for humans and machines to be working together, because machines can help us automate repetitive tasks and release space for our creativity and our creative brains to interpret the data and indeed derive insights. So machines have a significant role to play in helping us getting potentially quicker to the pre-phase that's going to help us derive those insights. So I feel that we're actually in an age of intelligence amplification, which I'm sure you've heard of. You've heard this term coined before. I didn't invent it. In fact, it's been around since the 50s and 60s, and it was first coined by cybernetics and early computer pioneers. But it is obviously now used quite often in a research context, especially I've heard it coined as well by Stan, and I cannot pronounce his name, who's the head of CMI for Unilever, and I've been in talking alongside him at conferences, and he's used similar terms. And the reason why it's used, it's because it essentially promotes the use of artificial intelligence with humans interpreting context. So I think the reason why you need machines is that, and humans working together, is that artificial intelligence or machine-led techniques to analyze content can only take you so far. And it's true that automated analysis is really, and machine learning is really helpful to give you a landscape view of the data, in the same way that we saw earlier about when we saw a view of what these articles were containing. But I think a layer of human vetting and digging will always be required. What's interesting as well is that the question, there's often a belief that AI is unbiased as well, which in reality is not necessarily true, and that some of the machine learning techniques that exist often have biases themselves. A study by AI researchers at Princeton and Bath, the University of Bath, revealed that actually there are biases in everyday speech, which means that NLP in the machine learning context potentially is biased as well, because our speech is biased and fundamentally is not purely data driven. So I found that very interesting, because it actually shows that there are biases everywhere as well, which means that relying on AI means that you might be missing a trick if you're not having human analysts analyze the data as well. I'm going to finish this talk by showing you a post. It's a bit blurry, but hopefully you can see what it says. Somebody on my network, and I'm sure that if you might have seen it yourself, and I found it over the weekend. It's from LinkedIn, and this person was actually begging the question essentially as to whether social media or the analysis of social media was subjective, and 36 people responded through comments on LinkedIn. And I analyzed those comments to see what the response was as part of preparing for this talk. What was interesting is that many of the people who responded highlighted the added complexity that social media conversations presented in being analyzed, because it's unstructured and also because it's often from multiple disparate sources, and also because it can be cut into so many different ways, including analyzed by machine learning techniques. So what was interesting is that it raised a bigger question over whether the same rigor needs to be applied to the analysis of social media as with other data sets, because ultimately it's such a flexible medium that it would be quite easy to retrofit conclusions and therefore bias outcomes because the data set is so flexible. So people were saying, well, it's, any analysis is potentially going to be subjective, but also you could manipulate the data to want to say what you wanted to say, which is perhaps true of many data sets, but maybe even more true when you're looking at unstructured data. So I will finish by saying that it's actually emotional and not artificial intelligence I think we need in our world today, and even more so in social media research, as I believe its prime purpose is to make sense of people's needs and attitudes from unprompted conversations. Thank you very much. Cool.
Thank you, Gaelle. Just coming back to your slide there about the same piece of data to 3 people, if I were to ask somebody to rank which stores they're most likely to go to, and they rank them in the order, and I give that to 3 analysts with different backgrounds, the first one may say, oh, this person is price driven. Look, they've got Aldi and Lidl near the top. Somebody else may say, oh, actually, I know where they live. They've picked the stores that are closest to them. And another person may say, you know what, these are the ones with the best gluten-free products. So that subjectivity is there all the time.
Exactly.
So of all the things you've seen, and you've used quite a few automation and AI techniques in your role with social media and looking at images, which has been the one where you said, we couldn't have done that without the machine? Anything?
I think where, oh, sorry. Yeah. I think where it's not necessarily images, I would say, but where, when you're trying to understand the virality of content. So it's incredibly hard to do manually. In fact, it's almost impossible to do manually. And it's something that people always want to know is, where does this trend start? Or which group did it start amongst? And I think, when we've used technology to do this type of stuff, we've had much richer answers than if we tried to do it in a more qualitative fashion by analyzing samples of content. And the reason for that is, I'm going to quote a specific example that of a project that we did where we were trying to understand the different communities that liked a leather goods brand, and we used a specific tool to allow us to essentially identify clusters of followers within Instagram and Twitter. And this tool surfaced some of the key groups based on their interrelationships, so who follows whom, if you like, or who follows him in the case of Twitter, and also in the case of Instagram. And I think that was really, really helpful, because it allows to say, well, there's actually a community here and different community groups here, and it allowed us actually to, the tool allowed us to identify the different communities, but then we were then able to look at those community groups more manually and identify what they had in common based on their conversations, based on their biographies, and then find that, for example, you had different disparate groups which were fans of that brand. So, for example, you had a more K-pop audience, Korean pop. I'm sure you're you do a lot of work in APAC, right? So you'll be familiar with K-pop. But you had a lot of K-pop fans. You had a lot of hip-hop fans, and we actually noticed that this brand was liked by a lot of music followers, because it was adopted by a lot of stars within those different cohorts. So, but we wouldn't have been able to do that easily doing it manually.
Yeah. And that's an example of intelligence amplification, would you say?
Yes, absolutely. Because what you're doing here is you're letting the machine do the heavy lifting for you and identifying those groups, and then you're trying to find, the hook between these groups, and that's only a human can do that.
Super. Thank you so much, Gaelle.